All right. Welcome back. Happy Friday, everybody. We're back in Angular Nation Experts channel. We have Alex Rickabaugh today. This is so exciting. We love it when Alex comes to visit us. A few quick announcements. I made notes because I had a lot of stuff I wanted to share with you guys, but we're going to go through it really quickly. First, big thanks to AG Grid, our sponsor. We love AG Grid. If you want to sponsor, also, we have almost 6,000 Angular nerds with us now. So if you want to be a sponsor, reach out, let me know. Live meetings, we have about 5 times a week we have in our premium spaces, and we have Angular GDEs helping out, plus the Angular team comes to hang out with us, which we love. If you're watching on YouTube, you should come and join us for the live calls. It's way more fun. Come and join us. A whole year for the price of a single conference ticket. Pretty cool. If you need Angular help, reach out. Hiring at angularnation.net also if you want to hire some people. Okay. Keeping up with the Angular team. Why do we care about keeping up with the Angular team? Because I hear a lot of like, there's so much going on. They're like doing all this cool new stuff, right? And it's really hard to keep up. Why do we have these study groups to keep up with the Angular team? Because in a nutshell, it's easier. Like all the stuff that they're giving us, if we're using this new syntax, if we're taking advantage of all this stuff, like Alex is our friend and he's just making our job so much easier. And so as you're updating, you're going to have less and less code and more shortcuts, and it's beautiful. So it makes your job, Alex is making our job easier. So that's why we want to keep up. Okay. I had this fun idea. This is a soft introverts welcome. I also want to welcome real quick, Daniel and Thomas, new to the group today. Hello, Daniel. Hello, Thomas.
Hi.
And I want to do a soft introverts welcome. Everybody on a scale of 1 to 10 in emojis. How excited are you that Alex Rickabaugh is here today? Let's see some emojis. Right? Yes, yes. Okay. One last thing. After the talk, as always, we have Q&A. Participation is highly, warmly encouraged. One rule, obviously, be nice to our guests, which we don't even have to say because everybody here is so sweet. We have all the cool people here today. It's great to see everybody. Okay, and with that, I'm going to kick it over to Alex. Alex, thank you so much, as always, for making time for us. We love it when you come to visit us.
Of course. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for coming. So
I always end up joining these from home here in California, but like not when I'm actually in your time zone. One of these days I need to make it for actually like beers and social.
I think we need to do like Angular Nation Amsterdam. I think that's starting to become on the horizon. I think that needs to be a thing. And I'm gonna go and get the Angular Connect, and we'll just do it all like, Angular Nation, Angular Connect. I think that needs to happen, but not yet. We're taking baby steps. Okay, so can you, before you share your screen and jump into this, which I'm very excited about, I love it when you share your screen. Can you just give us like a background, like tell us what made you decide to do this talk?
Yeah. So this talk really comes out of the last year or so that I've spent explaining to people kind of like, why are we tackling reactivity as a question? Why are we, interested in things like signals? And I've been trying to find a way to kind of, there's lots of reasons behind it, but I've been trying to find one example that's like a really good, clear case for like, why does some of this stuff matter? And I think I've kind of distilled it down to this like 20-minute little exercise that we can do together.
Love it.
So I'll go ahead and share my slides. I did tweet the slides earlier. I can tweet to people afterwards because I've been giving this talk in a few different venues. But yeah, I've called it like Rethinking Reactivity. And yeah, it's basically trying to answer the question, like, why are we going down this route? Technically, what are some of the kind of problems that we see that are worth tackling? And why do we think we've kind of solved them in a clear and convenient way? So we're going to build forms, essentially. We're going to build a kind of small example that is very representative of how Angular Forms actually works internally and how just the forms pattern in a UI works in general. So we're going to build an input control that's kind of linked to a model that does input validation. So it has a value, it has a status, and it kind of two-way binds to an actual control in the UI that the user can interact with. And so this is what it looks like in code. It kind of fits nicely on a slide. This is going to be our model class. This is kind of equivalent to the form control, or if it's ng model, there's still a form control, it's just internal. And this class really isn't doing all that much. We have a value. We're only going to deal with string values for now. And we have some validators. And the validators are just functions that tell us whether or not they like the value. And so whether the model is valid depends on whether all of the validators agree that this value is good. And we have a way to kind of add validators over time. So this is what we're going to do in the actual UI. We need some way to bind our model class to a given UI control, an input control. So this is very similar to what like the form control directive is doing, or ng model. And here's that directive in code. So we match against inputs that have this model attribute. And we're going to take in as an input, required input, our model class. And past that, we set up kind of a bit of a hacky version of two-way binding. There's different ways of doing this, but I've opted for kind of what is the smallest code here, which is to essentially set up a host listener that watches the input control for when the user types and passes that value into the model. And then in ng-do-check, we're kind of doing the opposite. We're saying when change detection runs, let's see if the model value changed and pass it into the input control, if so. So we have kind of two-way binding working here. And this is what it looks like to actually use this thing in a template. So we have our value, which is an input bound to a model class that we create. And then we're just going to show the status with a ternary. Are we valid or not? And I add one simple validator that just says, like, the input can't be empty. With me so far? All good? Awesome. So it works. Fantastic. My input starts off as invalid, and when I type something into it, the status changes over to valid. Success. What do you think happens if we swap the order of these two things? So we try to show the validity status first before the input. It's actually a trick question. It works fine. So the kind of algorithm here doesn't actually care whether the status is shown first or not. But let's make things just ever so slightly more complicated here. We're going to add a directive onto this input that defines a set of illegal characters. And whenever one of these illegal characters appears, the input should be considered invalid. So here's our directive that's going to match against this illegal characters input. And because we're sitting on the same input element as our model directive, we can just inject the model directive. And we take, again, required input, set of illegal characters. And then all we're going to do is in ng on init, add a validator. And this validator loops over the illegal characters and says, hey, if the value has any of these characters in it, it's no longer valid. And that works just fine. So here, I've made the exclamation point illegal. And so the moment I type it, my validator switches to invalid. And we'll go one step further and say, what if the set of illegal characters, instead of being a static set in the template, if we make it actually dynamic? It's coming from a data source somewhere, because we always, yeah. So here we'll make it an input, which I've called forbid, where the user can type in a set of illegal characters, right? We want to put users in charge of their own data validation. And so we'll pass that input to the illegal directive. And it turns out this doesn't actually work. Something's broken. If we start typing in the set of illegal characters, nothing actually updates. And the reason why is a little bit counterintuitive, and you kind of have to know a bit about how Angular works to be able to figure this out, which is that nothing is forcing change detection to run when the user types in this input. Remember, we're relying on Zone.js to kind of know, hey, like something happened in the background and I need to reconcile the UI, but there's no actual event that happens when the user presses a character. So if we want this to work, right, if we want the forbid characters to end up inside the input, we have to tell Angular something needs to happen every time the user changes this input. And so we have kind of a tricky way of doing this, where we create an event binding for input on this illegal characters input, but we don't actually need to run any code for the event. So we just kind of use null as an empty event handler. But this will still cause Zone.js to say, oh, something might have happened. I need to run change detection, and it'll update our validity status. So now our control is actually working. If I enter the question mark as an illegal character here, the status switches to invalid if that character happens to be present. We're done. We built forms, right? We can ship it. Not quite. So there's actually two things wrong in this design, two kind of fairly critical pieces that are not perfect here. And you kind of have to know a little bit about how Angular works to figure these out. Again, that's kind of a common theme here, needing to kind of understand the details of the system to know where the sharp edges are. And the first thing has to do with how Angular assumes data is going to flow through your UI, through your templates. And that's kind of top to bottom. So we talk a lot about unidirectional data flow. Unidirectional data flow is a good thing. It makes the data flow in our applications a lot easier to reason about if it's not circular, if it's not creating these cycles and kind of doing multiple rounds of updating. But Angular has kind of an additional constraint, which is that it's expecting the data to flow in the same direction as your UI template from kind of top of the UI to bottom. And that can be a hard constraint to meet. And we can see this by kind of moving the status of our display here to the top instead of the bottom. And before that worked fine, but now if we do that, things kind of stop updating. Right? I enter exclamation point here and the valid status didn't change. Like, what's going on? And if we look in the console, we find that Angular left us a very nice present in the form of an ng0100 error message that says, hey, some expression in your template was changed after it's been checked, right? What's going on here? So to understand this, to kind of pick this apart, we can build up a mental picture of what the data flow in this template actually looks like. So we have our expression that's kind of trying to decide, do I show the text valid or invalid? And that expression is depending on the model.valid status. It wants to know what those validators are saying about the value of the input. And the validators, of course, are depending on the current value. Except this isn't actually reality. We have kind of a hidden dependency that we've added through this illegal characters directive. Because one of our validators is asking, what are the illegal characters in the template? And I'm going to loop over those and check those against the value. And so our validator is depending on this input. And so the overall valid status that we're trying to show in the UI is depending on this input. And that's a problem because we're kind of doing things out of order here. We are reading the status of this model.valid, which is depending on the input, before we actually get to the input in the template and update it. So we are changing the valid status once kind of the step 2 executes here, after we've already read the valid status in step 1, right? Expression changed after it was checked. So is this fixable? Can we save this design? Sure, right? We know how to fix expression changed errors, I think. Set timeout to the rescue. Right, and it always, like, I don't know about you, but whenever I type this inside of a component, I feel a little bit dirty. Like, I feel a little bit like I shouldn't be doing this, but I'm like, I know it's going to work, right? And this is actually exactly what you want to do in these scenarios. Because what we're trying to do is say, hey, Angular, I need to update the model, but I'm at a point in the change detection cycle where I'm not allowed to. So I need to postpone my update to the next change detection cycle. I need to start again from the top and make some changes and then have you kind of go and update the UI top to bottom again. And this is a one-line fix if you know where to put that one line, right? And this is not just a contrived example. This is exactly what Forms, the real Forms package, is doing internally. We're not using set timeout. We're using microtasks and promises and things like that. But it's the same principle. We want a new round of change detection as we update the values or the validation status and things like that. So we can fix that problem. But there's another problem here that's a little bit tricky. Our Forms system is not quite compatible with onPush currently. So let's look at what this looks like. To kind of pick apart this problem, let's look at showing the validity status in a slightly more fancy way. So instead of a text, valid or invalid, let's make a status display for it. And all this is going to do is toggle a CSS class based on whether the model is valid or not. So we're kind of taking the model as an input in this component, and we're showing this div, which is toggling the valid class based on model.valid. And this is the extent of my CSS skills. I made it a circle that changes color. So this is actually working. But if we set this component to onPush, now all of a sudden my circle stops working. Right? You can see that, like in the text node, it says we're supposed to be valid. We're not entering any forbidden characters here, but the validity circle is still red. And in fact, it will never update. And that makes sense if you know how onPush works, because onPush has a number of rules that control whether an onPush component will actually update. So they update when their input bindings change. They update when an event listener inside fires. So if you click a button that's inside the onPush component, that click event will cause the onPush component to be checked. And they update when you tell them to, through mark for check, or something like the async pipe, which is doing a mark for check internally. And so, in other words, what we're doing here in this component is a little bit broken, because our model.valid status can change, but nothing is going to, this component has no way of listening to those changes. It has no way of knowing when it needs to be updated, kind of because the point where the change is happening is far away from the point where we actually care about the valid status. So we could fix this as well. We could fix this by using observables, right? This is kind of what the async pipe is supposed to be doing, where inside of an onPush component, you can use the async pipe and then push changes through observables, and the onPush component will update correctly. But that's going to be a bit of a bigger change, because we have to go back to our data model and kind of rethink of it in terms of observables. So we need to make what we want is the valid status to be observable, which means we need to kind of cast it in terms of observable derivation from the value, which means our validators kind of need to understand observable status. And because we can change the set of validators, that kind of has to go inside of probably a subject that we update. And we're going to need our legal characters input, which is a dependency of the validator. That has to be observable. So we kind of have to cast everything in terms of RxJS in order to flow these changes through the system. And the moment we do that, we introduce kind of this level of asynchronicity where we're not guaranteed that a validator will behave correctly and always return a valid status. Maybe it's doing something asynchronous. It's going off to the database and asking, is this a valid thing? So we have to deal with potentially like the validators, being null for a while with the async pipe. And then, adding all of the share replays and stuff so we don't end up computing this stuff multiple times. And this is where we've kind of looked at this problem and realized that signals are actually a much better fit for flowing data through the UI in cases like forms. So I'm not going to talk about the APIs of signals. Let's just go ahead and kind of dive in and see how they help to solve some of these problems. So we can go back to our model class and kind of replace the primitive values, the standalone values, with signals. So what we're going to do is make the value of the model a signal. We want to be able to change that over time. And the valid status can then become just a derivation on top of the signal. So we make our validators a signal because we can change that set of things over time. So we have two sources of data, the value and the validators. And notice that the validation functions didn't really have to change. They are still pure functions that take a string and return a Boolean status. They don't need to know anything about signals. We're just going to run them inside of this valid computed on top of the value of the model. And now we can update our validity display component with my fancy CSS circles to just read the the valid status off the model as a signal. And that's actually enough. Angular understands now it can track the dependency of this signal in the template, and it knows when this valid status has to update. And we need to make the set of illegal characters. This is one of the other things that can change in the system. We want that as a signal as well. And Angular in the future will have required inputs, right? I should have updated this with the new syntax. So maybe I can show that a little bit later. But we can use our signal input here to make this validator actually read the set of illegal characters as a signal. And it's still a pure function. It's still just returning a plain Boolean value. This was a very local change, right? We didn't have to go and reconstruct the entire validation system under signals. But that's enough because we run this function inside the computed for valid status. It's going to pick up that, oh, I'm depending on this set of illegal characters and I need to update whenever that changes. So we've kind of told Angular now about this extra dependency edge that we had, where the valid status actually depends on this input that we're getting. And that happened kind of automatically behind the scenes. So what about that set timeout? We don't need it anymore, actually. Because Angular understands that a signal is changing, that's enough. It knows to go and kind of run change detection, even if the data is kind of flowing in a way that Angular didn't expect, if it's trying to flow from the bottom of the graph up to the top. So everything we've talked about here, with the exception of model inputs, which will be, signal inputs, which will be coming in a 17.x probably release. Everything we've talked about kind of works already in version 17. So what I wanted to do next is kind of look a little bit into the future and see where we're going from here, to talk about kind of the plan going forward. And if you were paying attention to the RFC, or really the 4-part RFC around signal components and signals in Angular, this plan probably looks a little bit familiar. So we posted an RFC where we basically described, we'll introduce signals into the framework, and then we'll create this thing called signal components. And signal components are components that kind of only pay attention to signals. They have a much simpler kind of model for how data flows. We think they're much easier to reason about than the current kind of on-push model. You can think of them as components with really good guardrails. And the idea was that applications would be able to incrementally migrate from zone components to signal components because they're interoperable. And once all of your components and your directives in the application were onto signals, then you could drop zones entirely. You could start using signal change detection instead of zone change detection, and yay, you have a big party to celebrate. Your application is zoneless. We like to party. But as we started kind of exploring how this would work in practice and started talking to bigger applications about what it would take to do these kinds of refactorings, we learned a few things. First of all, we saw that this proposition of getting onto zoneless when you had all signal components was very all or nothing, requiring you to update every component in your application, and all of your libraries would have to be using signal components as well. And that just seemed like too big of an ask for people to wait until they were able to achieve all signal components to be zoneless. Another thing that we saw is this idea that you could incrementally migrate to signal components one by one was actually kind of flawed, because as we started trying to do this with some of our prototypes of signal components, we immediately saw that like it's actually not the components that are the hard part of this migration, it's the data flow in your application. So before you can update even a single component, you kind of have to go and put your data in signals so that the signal components can function properly. And that model didn't really kind of fit how we wanted people to approach the migration. It's much easier to migrate component by component rather than refactor your data all at once. And just in general, it kind of felt like all of the new features, the signal inputs and queries, et cetera, were locked away behind this thing that was hard to get to. And so we really kind of went back to the drawing board and thought, can we make this a much more incremental proposition? Is there a way to get to signal reactivity that doesn't have this kind of all or nothing gated access to the new features? And so this is the kind of current plan, the plan V2. And it starts off the same way, right? Ship signals in Angular, check mark, done. But then kind of the next step is to provide what I call signal IO, which is really like the framework starts producing signals as well as consuming them. So that's like signal inputs and signal queries, those sets of features inside existing Angular components. So in an on-push component or a default change detection component, being able to use signal inputs, being able to use signal queries, being able to rely on kind of the signal features and templates, which doesn't have as many guardrails as the signal components that we were thinking about. It's kind of, you're still able to kind of make changes in a way that Angular doesn't understand, but you do get, it has a much lower barrier to entry. You do get to use these features much earlier. And we also think we can do zoneless kind of in existing on-push applications. We can, if your application is working with on-push across all of the components, we think we can make zoneless work without needing to get to signal components. For a really well-behaved application, without even needing to use signals at all. So without going and refactoring all of your data, being able to kind of still get the benefit of not needing Zone.js. And then signal components come along and add the safety to it. They add the guardrails, they add the intuition, the intuitive data flow, so that when you're using a signal component, you know that you can't get it wrong. As long as you're updating signals, Angular will understand and update the template correctly. Whereas in on-push, there's so many ways you can kind of like make things, you know, create a mistake where the component isn't going to update. And the same as before, once we kind of know that your components are signal-based and they're not changing in other ways, we can kind of optimize change detection even further. Maybe do things like checking per view and et cetera. And what we like about this plan is there's a lot more partying. You can kind of see that we're partying every step of the way, right? Because you're getting benefits as you adopt these features, and you're able to do so much more incrementally. And I kind of have one more thing here, which is there was a part of the RFC for signals that didn't get a whole lot of attention, that kind of surprised me. And that was model inputs and the integration of two-way data binding with signals. And so remember before we had to kind of add this input event set to null to tell Angular, hey, I need you to run change detection when this thing changes. Another way to achieve that we're looking at is, what if you could just two-way data bind to a signal, to a writable signal? And then that would be enough for Angular to understand, hey, you're changing the signal, something depends on it, I need to go and update the template. So without Zone.js, without event listeners, or without hacky event listeners, this is a way we can kind of connect the UI so that this input value flows where we want it to. So yeah, that's kind of that's the plan.
Thank you so much. This was, I really, expression changed after checked was one thing that I learned that I really, really struggled with when I was learning. And I had to kind of learn change detection backwards because of that error, because I was getting that
Yeah.
error. The first time I got it, I just kind of banged on it until I got it working. And I didn't really understand how I got it working. I just found something, but it wasn't correct. It just, was like a workaround. And so actually understanding how this is meant to be done, I love what you guys are doing. So we already have hands going up.
We have a if you haven't watched Pavel and Mai's talk, Quo Vadis, like where is Angular going? I highly recommend it. We have a great slide from that talk on expression changed that I think really captures our new attitude around these kinds of things. Which is going to be summarized as like, don't stop yelling at developers.
This error really kicked my butt a couple times.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So expression change is exactly that. It's like the framework is trying to tell you that you violated some rule that it had for you. And Angular is correct here, but that's not the best developer experience, right? When you're just trying to like get things done and ship your code, and the framework's like, oh, sorry, you tripped over some invisible wire that you didn't know was there. So the talk is on, I think NG Rome published it on YouTube, or at least a part of their live stream video still. I can try and track down a link for it. But
if anyone finds it, drop a link in the chat for us, please.
Yeah. I think Ania tweeted about it. So if you follow him, you kind of already have it's almost as good as watching over our shoulder.
Yeah.
Cool. Yeah, let's take some questions, I guess.
We had a hand up. I think Daniel had a hand up. Craig just tweeted the link to the
thank you, Craig.
The question. Okay. No, we don't have hands up. Who's got questions? Questions, comments?
Yeah, I have a question.
Go ahead, Dominic.
In the two-way binding example with the forbidden signal, how would it look inside the model? Like, because you did not call the signal, right? You just passed the signal in, and would you just use the signal input in the directive, or how would that work?
You were talking about this, where I had the forbidden characters, right?
Yeah, it was, I think, on one of your slides, like one of the last ones. Yeah, exactly.
Something like this, right?
Mm-hmm.
There's no directives here. This is the DOM. This is the value of the input element.
Mm-hmm.
And what we're exploring is like Angular would know, for example, that the value of an input in HTML is something that you can react to. So it's something that you can two-way bind to, and it would kind of understand that this would break down into almost the equivalent of like input value is the illegal character signal, and then the input event is like illegal chars set of event target value, right? So Angular would kind of be understanding here that value of an input is something that we can two-way bind to, and it would break it down for us to set up this bidirectional link to a signal.
And when we now would create our own component with two-way binding?
Yeah, so for your own components, like, if I want to do this, like, class my input or something, that is this thing we call the model input, which might be like, initial string value here. And then I can do the exact kind of operation. My input value is, my signal.
Oh, I have not seen that there will be a model input. Yeah.
Yeah.
But that's in the RFC, I guess, then?
That's in the RFC, yes.
Okay, thanks.
It just keeps getting cooler.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so model inputs are really two-way bindable inputs. So they're inputs that where the component might want to actually communicate back to you, like, hey, you bound this thing, but I'm also going to be able to change it internally. And a pretty common example of that is like a select control, where you're choosing from a different option. And you might have like the selected, index starts off as 0. And it's possible for, an outside driver of this form to say, hey, I want to like be able to bind this to a model and change the selected thing. Maybe I'm like hitting a reset button, then I need to go back to 0. Or I'm like loading a new data for the form and I want to like set all the selects to the right index. But also the user can just go and change it. The user can select a new thing from the control, and we need to be able to communicate from the select back out about that. And so that's kind of the definition of a model input. People do this today. Material does this all over the place, just by updating the actual input property, and they have the input property as public. So this kind of captures that pattern in signals.
Okay, thanks.
Tom, I think.
Hey, Alex, how you doing? I haven't got a chance to use signals yet. I know one of the pain points of RxJS, and I know they're different beasts, but it was always debugging. So I'm just wondering, in terms of the dev tools, is there integration with signals, or is there a need for it?
It's definitely on the roadmap, and actually, there's a couple of community members now who are kind of working together and exploring actually building this feature in the dev tools before we were able to get to it. Okay. So there's a few PRs open now on like starting to visualize the signal graph and things like that. Okay. Yeah, ideally in dev tools, you'll be able to kind of see the signals, see the dependencies, see where your templates are kind of consuming which things. Maybe even like poke values into them and see what updates.
Yeah, great.
That's another thing that you could, while you're sharing your screen, if you wanted to, you could show us, because I think there are new features in DevTools that now in the last couple of versions.
Yeah, I don't think I have any examples set up for that, but
that's okay. That's okay.
Yeah,
there are new features always coming out.
I don't have the DevTools installed because I'm actually not like I'm not building and working on them, nor am I like working on applications that need them. So. I just never actually set that up.
Anybody have more questions for Alex?
Maybe in terms of best practices, I was surprised to hear that run outside of Angular was a solution for you. I mean, that's great. I'll push that, but I've seen people use the ng on changes lifecycle hook to solve this. I've seen a lot of people just use that mark for check with the change detector ref. And these are all people that, they saw it wasn't updating. Let's just try something until it works. And then they leave it there. Would you steer against those specifically so I can tell them, no?
Actually, I think all of those things I would describe as like good practices. So that the ng zone, right? ng zone run outside Angular and ng zone run to kind of get back into the Angular zone. Those are tools you reach for when for kind of two reasons. One is because you're doing something and Angular is overreacting because it doesn't understand what you're trying to do. So if you're trying to I want to listen to the scroll event or the resize event or like mouse move or something like that. Angular will assume that if you just subscribe to the event normally, anytime one of those events fires, you might have updated the UI. And so it's going to run change detection over and over and over as the mouse is moving around the page because it doesn't know any better. Yeah. You could very well be updating the UI and you're trying to show the XY position of the mouse, but typically that's not what applications do. They're watching that event and then there's some condition that they're waiting for. And when that condition happens, then they want to do an update. And so run outside Angular and then run back in Angular is a way of kind of opting out of that change detection until you really actually do want it for events like that. Also, like run in the zone is something you can do when you're using a browser API that Zone.js doesn't patch. So if you're going through kind of a more esoteric API like the WebRTC or something like that, that Zone doesn't patch by default, one of the options you have is just to kind of go back into the zone yourself when you're ready to do updates. Mark for check is the API to interface with on-push components. So if you're trying to build a directive or trying to build a component that's on-push or is compatible with being used in an on-push context, Mark for check is kind of the API that you have to tell Angular, hey, I'm changing something that needs refreshed in this on-push component, whether it's a host binding or a binding in the template or something like that. What I see people doing that I really highly discourage is calling detect changes, actually. That to me is an anti-pattern because it's kind of making change detection reentrant, recursive, which is very often not what you want to do. That's swinging a very large destructive hammer at a problem, which is probably better solved with a set timeout or with a like Mark for check itself. And the last thing you mentioned was ng on changes.
Yeah.
ng on changes is where you should be reacting to inputs changing. So I always tell people do that instead of use input setters. The problem with input setters is you become very dependent on the order in which the inputs get set. So if you're like pushing to a subject from your input setters and you have like 3 or 4 inputs, the order in which those events happen depends kind of arbitrarily on the order in which Angular chooses to update the inputs in a template, which is not guaranteed. And so ng on changes is really the safe place that you have to react to inputs changing that's not order dependent because you get every change at once.
Got it.
And signals kind of sidestep that problem because you really don't need ng on changes anymore. You can take your input signals and make computeds of them, and that is not sensitive to the order in which things get set. But I love this discussion because it really highlights the point I was kind of trying to make in the slide deck, the presentation, where all of these things require you to kind of have some knowledge of how Angular operates in order to use them correctly, right? You need to understand how zone is working in order to know when you need to exit the zone, when you need to jump back into the zone. You need to understand how on push works and how change detection works to say, oh, I need to mark for check in these particular places. Otherwise, you just end up kind of spamming it like you spam flush in tests, right? Like you put mark for check just because maybe this will fix the problem. Same goes for ng on changes, right? You kind of have to know what you're doing in order to use that correctly. And that's one of the overarching things we're trying to address in Angular going forward is let's really cut back on the amount of knowledge you need to hold in your head in order to use the framework well. Angular should just work and get out of the way and let you spend your time and your energy focusing on your application problems, not on making the framework kind of perform well.
That would be wonderful.
So the idea behind signals, right, is that signals just work. If you set a signal, that should be enough to tell Angular, hey, go and update the template, right? I don't care if the data is flowing backwards. I don't care if you already checked that component. Like, just do it, right? And stop yelling at me. Stop making me jump through hoops or write set timeouts in certain places. Just like update the thing. Yeah.
I think we all learn about change detection the same way, just like Bonnie was reading her expression change after checked.
Yeah.
My input wasn't updating. It's like,
there's an interesting thing. Maybe I'll scare you a little bit. I often hear from people, we talk to developers and we ask them like, how often do you wrestle with expression change after checked? And people sometimes say like, oh, never, like it's not a problem for me. We're using NGRX, we're using like on push and async pipe, and so everything is fine. And I don't know if people know this, but there's been we'll call it a bug, design flaw really in Angular from the beginning, where if you have an on push component, expression change never happens inside of it. The actual check is broken. So the component won't be checked for these kinds of problems. So you may actually have expression changed errors that would be there if you weren't on push, but the on push kind of hides them and stops them from surfacing. Which is a little bit scary to me. But like this is super breaky to fix. We can't actually make this change because we'd never be able to land it in Google. So many templates and in many cases they're not actual UI problems because there's another change detection behind this that's going to come along and like do the right thing. It's more of a technical problem than anything else. But yeah, I think even for people who kind of think that they don't deal with this problem, they probably do a little bit. It just manifests in other ways. Michael, is it?
Mikhail.
Mikhail, okay.
Close enough. Hey, so I was just wondering, I mean, we have kind of like two form creation strategies now, so reactive and template based. And now once the introduction is there for like signal aware two-way binding, do you expect maybe maybe template based forms get another boost because it might actually improve that DX, or maybe even a third option might arise that actually are signal based forms? Is that something you guys are thinking about, or?
So this is also the slide from the Krovada's presentation that we did at NG Poland, NG Rome, which with Pavel's fantastic math here that 1 is greater than 2. I think we have a pretty good appetite to address the kind of fact that we have 2 form systems. I think that was the fact that we ended up in this state kind of was a hesitancy to pick one of the design patterns. And I think in reality, what we've learned is like neither of them are like optimal. And the developers we see who are using forms extensively tend to prefer something in the middle, where they're using kind of the API style of template-driven forms, but kind of making it a more reactive forms model. And so I think we have an appetite to like try and unify these things at some point, which isn't as scary as it sounds because they are actually one form system under the hood. There is only one kind of control type in Angular. There's only one structure for forms. It's just exposed with 2 different APIs. And so I think we do kind of want to reimagine what forms would look like as this unified thing, probably on top of signals. Signals are kind of the perfect solution for building a form system in my mind.
Yeah.
So we'll probably do this in multiple steps, right? Because we don't want to like make big sweeping breaking changes to forms at all. We'll probably kind of try to add signals to the existing system. So if you have forms today, they will just get better because you'll be able to interact with them with signals. And that solves a lot of the kind of data flow and expression change problems. And then we'll take a look at like, what does validation look like if it's based on signals instead of based on the current mechanism? How do you get how do you kind of create and manage these things on top of the kind of more template-like API, but more reactive forms heart?
Right, yeah, excellent. Good news that you guys are looking at it. I mean, my daily life is building forms, basically. And
yeah.
The first experiments I did with signals was actually to try and mesh the 2.
Yeah.
Which actually kind of works already. But yeah, a new pattern, I can kind of see that a new pattern would be wanted as well in the
Yes. Yeah.
for the big applications. Yeah. Oh, great. Thanks.
I think in general, like template driven form, people like template forms for the API to create forms, but they like reactive forms for the APIs to kind of do validation and manage the kind of, non-value side of the form. And so I think we're looking at kind of a split along those lines, where what if you have the best of both worlds?
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, I like the reactivity of reactive forms.
Yeah.
But then it becomes cumbersome when you have to do all kinds of conditions, and the APIs we have for example, dynamic validators and stuff based on another form. That seems really clunky always. So we always try to get some helpers and do all kinds of other stuff. But yeah, I can see signals really kind of, well, yeah, I guess I can see signals really help there.
Yeah, absolutely. Trying to find and this is, this is exactly kind of the challenge of forms in Angular, right? Is that the data flow is very different for how change detection wants to flow versus how data flows in the form. So I was trying to get at that with my little example, but in a more complex world, you have the value of the form, which might be set from the top or might be the user changing things. Then you have the validation status, which is really going backwards. It's saying the values are broken, right? Or the values have changed, so we want to compute some validation that's maybe like comparing multiple values. So the form valid status at the top depends on the valid status of the controls. And then once I have my validity status, I might want to show it in different ways, map it to the UI. And that might be, again, going from something happening at the top to individual controls at the bottom that might want to show, hey, the passwords didn't match or the emails didn't match or things like that. So the data flow in forms is fairly complicated and not at all aligned to the UI. And that's why signals are just going to be, a breath of fresh air, I think, for working with forms and form data. Dominic, I think, had his hand up.
Yeah, I had, but it was answered.
Oh, okay. I'm reading your mind.
I want to remind everybody that Alex can answer all kinds of questions about Angular, and it's okay to ask even questions that you might think are beginner questions, because there are some things that are not so intuitive when we're first learning Angular. So all questions are welcome.
And it doesn't have to be signals, like anything.
Yes. Well, yeah, Tom, go first.
Yeah, I was just going to ask a general question. Most applications that get somewhat complex, people start talking about state management libraries. I'm just kind of curious on your thoughts on the impact signals have on the need for them.
Yeah, so we have a kind of regular sync with the state management authors in Angular. So, we talk with NGRX and NGXS and State Adapt and RX Angular and kind of, everyone who's really working on a big state management library. And so we're working with them to explore what signals look like on top of state management and kind of where that boundary fits. So today we've been focused on kind of like updating the template. I keep going back to this NG Rome presentation, which is kind of hilarious. Yeah, I think I love Pavel's like creativity with slides. So we're talking about like, hey, we've been working on signals. We're using them right now in a very synchronous capacity to like, once you have derived the new state, and you want to tell the templates about it, you want to like update the UI, you can use signals to do that, and they're integrated in change detection, and kind of you have signal inputs and things like that. But we're actually going after a much bigger fish, and this fish looked fairly huge on the like movie theater screen for NG Poland. So it's a very big fish, but we're looking at data flow in the applications. From front to back, and so that includes things like the starting with the events and the HTTP requests and async derivations and stuff like that. And so I think you will see as time goes on, we move signals more from like something just used in templates to something that's a bigger architectural piece for how data flows in applications. And so like things like signal store in NGRX are kind of starting to tackle some of those parts of the problem space. And I think you'll see more things like that, both from the state management community as well as us trying to build primitives that allow them to better achieve the things they're trying to do.
Okay, great, thanks.
Craig, sir.
Tell me if this is not really an Alex type of question, but it's just forefront on my mind because I'm starting a new project and it's big. What do you suggest in terms of sort of having a mock backend so you can just focus on the UI? I've tried a number of different approaches. None of them were that great. I tried it, in Angular JSON, you can replace services with another class. And that was working for a while, and then it started ballooning. So I have another approach using a tool called Macoon now, and that's probably going to blow up too. What have you seen that's worked?
A mock backend in the sense of running like integration style testing, where you're running the whole app, the mock of your API.
I just wanted to send you back dummy data that I can use to build the screen, and then when the backend guys get it working, hopefully I'm not too far misaligned with what they're going to return, and I'll just make the tweaks and I'll be done. Have you seen anything that works well?
Yeah, I think like that's a bit outside of my area of expertise.
Yeah, okay.
One of the challenges of being a framework developer is you're really no longer an application developer.
Okay.
If I can jump in, this is something that I've actually seen a lot in real life doing enterprise consulting, and this might be painful, but I'm just going to tell you it might not be what you want to hear, Craig, but it's so much more efficient if the back-end development is done first. I'm just saying. Don't kill the messenger.
Okay.
Get the back end done first, because you know why. Yeah.
That's a tall order. I'm not sure.
I know.
That's
I'm
really
sorry. but I mean, you see the logic.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, because you have to do extra work. You have to keep updating when things come in, changes come in. But
yeah,
I just don't think we can do a big bang type approach in this case.
Yeah.
We have to.
But going forward, if you can start to try to plan for that, for the back end is going to be done, and then the front end is going to be done after, it's going to help a lot for the front end developers. Ask me how I know.
I believe you. Sorry, I've taken us off topic.
No, these are great questions.
Yeah, I've heard talking to like some of the application developers at Google. There's a pattern that a few of them are quite keen about called backend for front end. This idea of having kind of an extra backend in the stack that's doing a translation between the real backend and the kind of needs of the front end. I know that.
Love this. I was using GraphQL for this.
Yes.
And I really liked it for that.
The Wiz team at Google, my counterpart is Jatin, who kind of is one of the main tech leads on Wiz and works on they support a variety of applications up to and including search. And his take on this is always that like you need the back end to be cooperating with the front end. You can't have a back end that's like some arbitrary API and then you're trying to do the translation layer in the UI. That always ends up kind of in a suboptimal place. And so you really want your back end to be returning the data structured in a way that the front end is is able to process it well. And I think that works when you have a backend team that you can cooperate with. That's not always a luxury that all application developers enjoy.
I was going to say that's an if that I was surprised at how much that really is actually a problem in real life. Kind of a lot.
Yeah.
But it's a problem. But then you have a human problem that you're trying to write more code to address this problem.
Yes. Yeah, and you know, you can work around it, but there are limits to that. You know, and for something like Google search, right? Like they don't want to have code in their UI that's dedicated to just transforming the data from a backend that wasn't cooperating. They want to like just make the backend do the work.
There's so much code like that because the front end developers pay because they have accountability to the clients, but the backend only has accountability to the front end team. And so if there's not cooperation, sometimes there's not a lot of transparency, like there's not visibility on those problems. But if the front end team is not getting what they need, there's visibility. So sometimes it's easier to just go ahead and write whatever you need to transform it, but then you get it all in the client bundle. Okay, great questions. I love these questions because this is real world stuff that we really see a lot of. Pavel has a hand up. Hello, Pavel.
Hi. I have a question for Alex about the quote with the input setters that with NGON changes. I've been doing demo for computed binding, component input binding, sorry.
Mm-hmm.
And the question is, would you still track the changes for these inputs on the NGON changes? Or would you trust, in this case, to the inputs?
I don't think I understand what you're actually doing in the code. So let's see, like you want to do, you said you have input setters?
Yeah, well, yeah, of course. You allow the router to go with component input binding.
Right. I would still be doing NGON changes.
So you would not going with the setters there.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. Because the router has the same problem that templates do, right? Which is it's going to set the inputs in some order.
I didn't know.
Yeah. I mean, it can't set them all at once, right? It kind of has to. And so that order is going to be dependent on something, and you don't want to start relying on that in terms of making the correctness of your code. If all you're doing in an input setter is like deriving a you know, like I need to coerce this to a string or something like that, that's fine. The moment you start kind of pushing events into subjects and running like, you know, arbitrary reactions to the inputs changing, that's when you kind of need to be in the NGON changes space, because otherwise you have no guarantee that all the other values are available. So if you have two inputs that need to like combine somehow, that should always happen in NGON changes.
I have then another question to that. Sorry for that. It's gonna be quick, Dominic.
It's okay. These are good questions. You're okay.
When we are using, it's also with the component input binding. Then if I'm going with use the transform function, for example, for the resolve data, are these transforms gonna be working in the NGON changes, or?
Yeah, the NGON changes will have the transformed value.
Okay.
Yeah.
That sounds cool. Thank you.
Dominic.
Go ahead, Dominic.
Yep. Like for example, in the NGRX signal store and another state management like helper library, I saw that they, for objects in the state, they created a single signal for every property. And I also heard someone talking about the very like punctual change detection or re-rendering from just like a small part of the template. So like when we really want to go about performance, but should we also make our state like having these accessors for every property?
I don't think you need to make a computed signal for every property.
I mean, sorry, not a computed signal. Maybe if I send the link here.
Yeah.
They have this signal state function in there, right? and the user object, and the user has first name and last name property, and both
Right.
properties will be a null signal. So when
I think that
yeah.
the signal state, the way signal state works, you set this initial state, user, foo, and numbers. I'll share the tab just so you can see what I'm looking at. Like user, foo, and numbers become individual signals that you can update. But the first name, last name are just properties of the object that's inside the signal. I think that's the way it works.
But they have their console log, the state.user.firstname, and they call it like as it is.
State.user.
I
Yeah.
think that's a signal, right? And I heard, I think, someone saying that in the future you will implement the signal change detection so that in the template it will really just check the part of the template of a component where a signal was updated, right?
I don't know how this works. I think this is proxy under the hood.
Okay.
To kind of allow you to navigate through this object and maintain the reactivity there. So this is doing the derivation kind of on the fly of like getting you access to the first name, but maintaining the fact that it's a signal. I'm guessing under the hood that is doing, and I'll ask Marco to kind of confirm it for me. But I'm guessing that like state.user.firstname is basically saying state.user.firstname in the proxy. It's just done in a way where if you happen to like extract this without calling it, that it's still a signal.
Oh, okay.
So it's like the signal that's getting updated is still the whole state, or the state.user, I think.
But okay, because then I'm a bit confused because like on the site a bit underneath there's there they write the type for the user.last name and user as a signal in the link I've sent like
that you get that this thing is a signal. This thing is a signal of string, right?
Without the calling, right? It's a signal of
Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
So I think what they're doing is when you do state.user.firstname, this is producing a computed of state.user.firstname. It's kind of the select operation.
So now if I had a template and I only want to show the first name and not the last name, for example, for whatever reason, then if the first name was a signal on its own and I call first name, it would not, and I change the last name, then the template would not re-render, right? But if I use the whole user object and call the user signal dot first name and the last name changes, then the template would change detection, sorry, for the template would run again, right? So okay. So we should probably make sure that the accessors for our objects in the state have their own signals, right?
If it's, I would say if it's important for performance that the template not refresh, then that's something worth doing. It's not worth doing in all cases.
Okay.
Excellent questions.
Yeah. I think like people overestimate the impact of like running the change detection refresh in templates and underestimate the impact of the amount of bookkeeping that's required to not do that. Whenever I like profile Angular applications and look at what the performance problems are, it's almost never that change detection is like doing too much work, that you're change detecting too many templates or doing kind of too much, too big of a change detection. It's almost always that change detection is running too much. That there's some, like set interval or some like, library that got loaded, like add script on the page that's like spamming, causing change detection to spam at like, 60 frames per second or something like that. Their value of kind of doing change detection on a much more granular level starts coming into play when you have things like loops and tables that have, dozens or hundreds of rows. When you have a lot of content that's repeated, then it gets really interesting to be able to say, like, can we, change detect only the thing that's updating? But I don't know if you have like a static UI structure of a few hundred DOM elements, if it actually matters all that much for performance to kind of hyper optimize which ones get checked at any given point.
I learned about this especially when I started doing like pipes and custom pipes and things like that, custom validators or anything, that I would always throw a console log in whatever I was doing. And several times I was shocked that it would fire off like 1,000 times in my face. And I was like, whoa, 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 what's going on? Because I did not expect that console log to fire off 1,000 times for whatever it was that I was asking it to do. And so and of course you want to take those out, because the console log, if you have console logs sprinkled everywhere, that actually will affect your performance. So you don't want to leave those in production. But that was really good. If you're not really confident about how change detection works, sprinkle some console logs just so you can see what's going on, because sometimes it will fire off 1,000,000 times in your face and then you'll realize, don't do that. Okay. Mikkel said, Dominic, that was a great question. Thank you. We appreciate these questions because sometimes when you're confused about something, you're probably not the only one. So I love these questions. And Mikkel actually had a question also in the chat that was a good question. Mikkel, do you want to come off chat? Come off mute?
Yeah, I was wondering about, you mean about the nested signals, right?
Yes.
Yeah, I can imagine. I can remember doing some experiments with when signals were just in developer preview or even earlier. That I was trying to determine if you have an object which is a signal which contains signals, or right, or an array of signals, but the outer one also is a signal. What is the logic of actually updating? So if you update an inner signal, does it update the outer signal, or does the outer signal only update on a reference change? So if you do an actual new object or a new array.
Yeah, I'm really interested in things like this. So a great way to think about that, right, is like, let's say I have data that I want to show in a table, right? And so I have a signal of a bunch of data, and I'm going to do like, for data, or, like row of data. And here I want to show like row dot, value. Notice row here is a signal. I'm assuming like we're in signal components, so the for loop is reactive. One way of doing this is just to say, like, I have objects in here, right? Like this value is 3, this value is 2, this value is 1. And in that case, the way I update this data is I can kind of do two different operations, right? I can update and say, I have the values, and then I want to like add a new value. So like, change the array, right? And the other type of operation I can do is like change an individual item. And so I won't actually like write the code to do that, but basically like I'm trying to do, value 0 dot value is 4, let's say. And these are kind of two fundamentally different ways of interacting with this data structure. Either I'm changing the number, I'm changing the collection, or I'm changing an item inside the collection. And ideally, if I'm changing the collection, none of the templates inside for each row should need to update. And if I'm changing an item in one row, none of the other rows or the whole collection should need to update. And one way to achieve this is to say, okay, each value in this collection is actually a signal.
Exactly. Yeah.
And so here, when I push a new thing, I can push a new signal. And then if I just want to change one of them, I can say like data row 0 dot set to, value 4.
So so that last case, does that trigger data?
No,
it doesn't. Okay.
Not at all. Because data, as far as data is concerned, it's holding an object, which is an immutable thing called a signal.
Right.
So the signal identity does not change. In practice, I think things like this are really awkward for users to write. Already, this looks kind of crazy, right?
I had a little factory for it.
Yes, so I think
did
like
stuff for that.
this is exactly the type of thing that a state management library could do for you. To say, hey, I'm just going to let you say like, signal store or whatever of a bunch of value objects. And then the signal store under the hood will be like, oh, I have an array. I need to like make signals for all the individual items where it makes sense to do so. And then give you APIs to kind of, change the collection, change the values inside the collection in a clean way.
Yeah, I think sometimes you probably, if you have like complex tables that you're rendering and like 50 columns are just static, but the last the comment, you need something dynamic plus a button to update and an edit thing and whatever. So you get like a combination of so signals with nested signals or even nested signals. I'm curious how the nesting, I don't see a lot of examples of nested signals, so I'm really curious how that behaves, especially with what updates.
Yeah.
And if you start to use computed on like an inner or on the outer, but you reference only the inner signal, does the computed still fire or it doesn't? So I haven't experimented with it yet, but that's really interesting to me.
Yeah, same here. I've kind of been poking our like state management authors, like, hey, explore in this direction. I think it could be really interesting.
Yeah.
So I hope we'll see some kind of more experimentation in those areas.
Yeah, I'm really waiting for more patterns to emerge from the community before I really start implementing signals, especially for that more complex stuff. Obviously, signals for easy DOM updates is fine, but cool. Thank you.
Excellent questions. Just take a second. Alex, you want to take a drink? How are you doing? How are you doing on time?
I'm good.
Yeah.
I got nowhere to be.
Awesome.
So I would have a question that someone asked in the Angular Nation chat recently. And so when you create a new component, new standalone component with the Angular CLI, it will by default add the common module, right, to the imports. And he asked if there's a drawback when using the common module instead of importing, for example, async pipe, just the async pipe or just ngIf.
Not that I'm aware of. Personally, I prefer importing the individual things, but yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
I doubt you're going to pay much of a tree shaking cost because most applications are using like those things anyway.
And then what I wondered about, but maybe that's a bit hard because I don't have an example, but the deprecation of deploy URL.
Unfortunately, I don't know anything about that. Yeah.
Okay. Maybe I can ask Linko. Maybe he knows.
Yeah.
I would like to point out, because and actually, I believe the first day that we met Dominic, we got this. I also heard this from Connie, and I hear this from a lot of other people, that there are people who are really trying to learn all of Angular because they don't really completely feel confident with Angular, because there's some stuff like they understand most of it, but they don't understand all of it. And I really want to point out here, neither does Alex Rickabaugh, right? Nobody has all of Angular memorized. The docs are like thousands of pages. So if you have that expectation, if you're not feeling completely confident, first of all, come hang out with us. It helps. But do not have that expectation for yourself that you're going to know and understand every single thing, because I think Alex might be one of, if not the most knowledgeable person when it comes to Angular and answering these questions and helping us understand all of this. But even he does not have all of it memorized. So let that be a lesson to you. Go ahead, Phil.
I have one question for Alex. It's a little bit tricky, but
we're going to throw you a curveball, Alex.
It's okay.
Go ahead, Phil. He was saying,
okay.
bring it on.
Yeah, he said bring it on.
Oh, okay. If you wouldn't know anything about Angular right now, and you will be on the starting point when you want to learn Angular, what would be the first step? What would you want to know about Angular at all to get started with that?
Can I jump in, Alex?
Yeah.
I'm gonna let you answer, but I just want to put in my very quick 2 cents. If you are just now starting Angular, you came in at the perfect time, because you're here just in time for the brand new Angular.dev. I'm just saying. Go ahead, Alex.
I think that was going to be my answer too. Is like
I'm
the
sorry.
Angular
I just thought, I think that would be such perfect timing to be a brand new Angular developer right now.
The tutorial, the new tutorial on Angular Dev is really good. Yeah, I think I would be starting there.
And in terms of theory or something like that, for example, you told us about the change detection thing and so on, you know.
I'm a new developer, though. I don't know any of that stuff. I don't know that it exists.
Okay.
And I love that Angular.dev is like I learned better by doing. So one of the things that I loved so much about AngularJS when I first found it was that there was like, it was right there, like you could like play with it, right? I love that. So the fact that you can try things out and play with it, and it's free. I think it's like the best training resource that there is for Angular, and it's free, like free. So I don't want to nerd out about Angular.dev, but it's free, you guys. Anyway,
one thing
don't get me started. Dominic had it. Go ahead, Alex.
One thing I've been talking about with Minko, and you can ask him about this too, is we've kind of realized or decided that we don't talk enough about the technology that's behind Angular, like how it actually works, what some of the algorithms are, what the mental model inside the framework is. And that's something we want to start putting on Angular Dev as well, to add a section about, kind of the internals, how the framework actually works. So hopefully soon that will be the answer, even for that part of your question. Like, what are the resources to know kind of how it actually works behind the scenes?
Another thing that we really focus on a lot in the architect space and in the training that I've done over the years is writing less code. Because I think there are a lot of people that come in and they use Angular as like a container, and then they just throw a bunch of stuff inside of it and they call it Angular, and they're not actually using Angular to the full extent of like the beauty of what Angular can do for you. And they end up with way more code than they need. So this is really one of the most fun things about teaching Angular, is walking in and going, you don't need all that. You could just use this, and it's, you don't need all that code that you're writing. And they go, oh, wow, that's fun. So it can be, especially more and more as you update, then you go into the higher versions of Angular, and it's like, yeah, you don't need all that. I mean, you can do that if you want, but you don't need it. And it's beautiful.
I've seen that a lot from developers who come from other frameworks too, because they have React Brain or something, right? They have some like particular way they've learned to do things, and they try to do it in Angular, and they try to do the same things.
And the people who are really good at Angular write much less code. Because Alex will do all that work for you. And just come in here and make friends with Alex. You learn how it's meant to be written, and it's beautiful. And sometimes we get stuck along the way, and then we end up like trying to fix it, and we end up writing like extra code trying to fix it that we actually don't need. And that's really where I think it's so beautiful to be able to come in and ask you questions and really understand it, because we're going to write clean beautiful code and work with Angular and not against it. And Dominic has a hand up.
Dominic is also muted.
He is also, yeah, thanks for pointing that out. Like, if I want to contribute to Angular or want to understand the Angular, like the source code, the framework better, where would you start off? What do you think? What would be a good point to start looking?
Definitely, like, we try to be good about labeling issues on GitHub that we think are accessible to a first-time contributor as help wanted. Those typically,
I think there's a flag for that.
Yeah, not only are they kind of more self-contained problems that we see, we tend to make sure that those are issues that aren't going to take you into parts of the code base where you will start to go insane. We try to make sure that they're kind of accessible parts of the framework as well. And there are a number of talks that GDEs have given over the years that have really good deep dives into the Angular internals. There was just one recently that Tomas did on signals and how the signals library works. So there are resources like that. The framework has README docs in various places. I'm trying to do more of that, so to kind of capture more of the algorithmic side of things. So ultimately, I want the code base to kind of come with navigation, where you can move around inside of it and then start to understand what the pieces are. Yeah.
Okay. And which part do you find technically like the most interesting?
The most interesting?
Yeah.
Ooh, that's a good question. Probably the well, currently for me, it's the template compiler. The work that Dylan and Miles and I are doing on refactoring the way that templates get built. Because it's taken us through a lot of trying to understand, like, how does I18N actually work? How does content projection actually work? How do bindings and things actually work? That code is kind of coming to life and is very, I think, a good place to start learning about these different parts of Angular.
Okay, thank you.
I love these questions.
Something to do for the weekend.
Yeah. Daniel, sir.
Has a hand up.
Yeah, so I wanted to touch back on the discussion about Angular dev. Is there a plan on taking down, if you would even know that, on taking down Angular IO, or are you planning on pushing the same website on there, or what's the future of that?
I think the hope is that Angular dev will take over as the main documentation site in V18.
Mm-hmm.
That's right. The plan that I've heard, assuming that it's like has all of the content and kind of is accepted by the community as a good canonical source.
I have a little anecdote to share, if I may.
Mm-hmm.
A couple of years ago, I ran, Matt Carniato from the NGXS team. I ran Angular Beginners free workshop with him in Belgium a couple of years ago. And they really wanted to do like a beginner Angular 101 half-day workshop. And they asked us if we would put something together. And it was about the same time that the Angular Getting Started page was launched. And it was so great. And we looked through it, and it was really exactly what we needed, that we said, we're not going to prepare a workshop for this because the Angular team just put that up for us and we didn't have to. We were very honest about the fact that, like, this is free. This is like, the workshop was free, right? But basically we just ran a workshop and we walked through together and answered questions and just basically gave them moral support while they went through the actual getting started pages of the Angular docs. And it was great. And I highly recommend this. So if you know anyone who's getting started, or if you're getting started, if you're not really completely confident, absolutely the Angular docs. When we first started with Angular, it was not the same, you guys. So if you knew like how great you have it with these amazing Angular docs. So big shout out. And I think it wasn't it Mark Thompson that did most of that work on especially on the new Angular.dev?
Oh, it was so many people. Mark
It's
did
really wonderful.
Yeah, Mark did a huge amount of work moving most of the guides over and getting them on standalone. Emma was like just unbelievable. It's coordinating all of the things really.
Those two are amazing, and they're fun. They're so much fun.
And just like, Jeremy built a whole new pipeline for extracting API documentation and transforming it and showing it in the UI. Like, so many different contributions from so many people. A lot of the GDEs got involved. There's, much of the kind of code in the actual Angular dev site. A lot of pieces were contributed by GDEs who like got passionate about making certain things work better. Yeah.
And maybe you can talk a little bit about how, because I don't know if it's done yet, but you guys are going in a direction to streamline translations. And when I was doing enterprise consulting, this was really something that some companies, if you're operating a website that is in multiple languages in multiple countries, and you have all these clients all over the place, you might have dynamic content that needs to be, it's okay if you have like a whole entire page that's one translation, but if you have dynamic content that needs to be translated on the fly and you don't want to like repeat yourself over and over again, that kind of thing. And so the Angular docs is actually really an interesting journey for us to watch, because this is a common problem too, that we want to have all these translations in the least amount of work possible.
Yeah. I've heard some chatter on the translation side of things. I don't know anything specific.
I think we might want to circle back with Minko about this later, because I think it might have been him that we were talking about, that it's one of those things that it's not ready, it's not available at this moment, but this is something that we're looking at, of like making it easier for the Angular team and all of the people who are helping with translations to make it more dynamic, make it more streamlined, so that it's easier for everybody to do that without so much duplication. This is true. There are some tricky issues that we have that are not even really Angular issues, but just, the whole issue of scaling and trying to help people all over the world. Crazy stuff.
We have a requirement on top of translations. We want to be able to white label, they call it, so the end client can decide to override all the label names everywhere in the screens. And so we're sort of
on top of translations and dynamically.
Yeah, so you can switch from German to French to my language. Yeah, so we're hijacking the translate library, NGX translate, to solve this problem, and I hope that doesn't bite us.
Yeah, this is another problem that a lot of people, not that it's a problem, but it's a challenge that it's so tricky sometimes, because maybe there are different people solving it in different ways, and it's not that there's any specific way that's right or wrong. And it's really, I think sometimes it's a challenge for the Angular team to come in and commit to like, this is the way we're going to do it, because I think no matter what they do, people are going to disagree. And so you really have to try to be as universal as possible while also going towards the best solution. And this is why having so many discussions with the community is so valuable over the years. And I think it's been a huge labor of love, because when you get input from so many different users, it's difficult, but it's also really like, I love to hear about this journey of like, what's going on, what people are struggling with, because it's the same kind of stuff that I saw when I was consulting. Of so many people are struggling with these things, like expression changed after checked. Love it. Okay. Does anybody else have questions? No? Okay, good. So we're just about at the top of the hour, and I'm going to turn off the recording. And if it's okay, maybe Alex can stay with us just for a little bit after we turn the recording off, because sometimes we have more questions sometimes after the recording is off, just because people are shy, which is totally fine. But we have a tradition, you guys know the drill. Before we turn off the recording, please everybody come off mute And help me thank Alex for taking the time to come and hang out with us today.
Hey,
Thanks,
thank you very
Alex.
much.
Thank you, Alex.
Thank you.
Thank
Alex.
you.